As dusk slowly settled over New York, the city was wrapped in a cold, drizzling rain that seemed to weep for something forgotten. The droplets fell gently but persistently, pooling on the asphalt and bleeding into silvery streaks that shimmered under passing headlights. People bustled through the streets, tugging at their coats, quickening their steps, eyes darting forward without truly seeing, too caught up in their orbits to notice anything beyond them. The usual clamor of the city felt muffled beneath the blanket of rain, subdued, heavier somehow, seeping quietly into the skin of those who still had the patience to feel. Beneath the modest awning of an old butcher shop, where the warm, yellow glow from within fought valiantly against the chill outside, sat a German shepherd, perfectly still. Its shadow stretched long across the wet brick pavement, trembling faintly whenever the wind howled past. Yet the dog itself didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't retreat, and didn't advance. Its body was soaked through, the once thick coat now matted into heavy, grimy clumps that clung to its frame and reeked of dampness. Rain mixed with dirt had crusted into muddy patches on the fur that once bore pride. Here and there, bald spots revealed weathered skin marked with scars, silent relics of battles fought and missions completed, now forgotten. And yet, despite its gaunt and weary frame, the dog held a posture unmistakable in its dignity. Back straight, front paws neatly placed, head slightly raised, eyes fixed on the glass window ahead, where rows of crimson meat were displayed in neat order. It did not whimper from hunger, lick its lips in desire, nor wag its tail in pleading. It simply sat, silent, like a living statue cast amid an indifferent city. Everyone who passed looked at it differently. Some didn't even turn their heads, just glanced and hurried away, perhaps afraid that something deeper might stir within them. Others paused, locking eyes with the animal for the briefest second before quickly looking away, as if the dog's gaze made them feel guilty for their warmth and comfort. And there were those who, hardened by the city's unkindness, didn't care at all, too weary to spare pity for a creature they saw as useless, disposable, out of place. But if someone truly stopped, truly looked, they would sense something unusual about this dog. It wasn't a stray, not some aimless creature cast aside by a careless owner. It carried with it a rare aura, the stillness of one who once held honor, the patience of one disciplined by duty, and eyes so deep they made you feel seen in a way few beings could. It didn't beg, didn't resist, didn't flee. It simply waited, as though hoping for something it couldn't name, something that might never come. A sudden gust of wind swept down the street, lifting a man's coat and sending droplets flying. A curse rang out, then disappeared into the steady sound of rain. The dog flinched slightly, ears perking by instinct before relaxing again. It no longer had the strength to run, yet it had never allowed itself to collapse. Its front paws remained steady, even though the claws were chipped and blood had seeped from raw pads worn thin by wandering the city's cold, unyielding pavement. There had once been something sacred in this creature, and though life had stripped most of it away, it clung to the memory like a final thread of identity. Among the hundreds of thousands of lives rushing through this place, few would guess that this dog had once been a hero, once a part of something greater, once loyal to someone, once alive with purpose. Now all that remained was the unending rain, the encroaching darkness, and a silent, thin figure that the city refused to notice. But within those eyes, deep, calm, and sorrowful, something achingly human still lingered: hope. And it was that faint glimmer, that last ember of belief within its gaze, that made passers-by feel inexplicably unsettled. They could sense, even without understanding why, that this animal wasn't harmless in the usual sense, but rather that it had once belonged, had once mattered, had once been respected. The way it sat, despite the hollowed frame, the tangled fur, the trembling legs, held a quiet, inexplicable solemnity, It wasn't the posture of a stray, not the timid crouch of a beggar, but the poised, alert stillness of one trained to wait, to obey, and to never break formation. Its neck lifted slightly, back held straight despite exhaustion, ears standing tall, gaze unwavering. Everything about it whispered that something sacred had once been entrusted to this dog. And though forgotten, it still held fast, as though such duty had fused with its very being. Its eyes did not merely hunger, they understood. And perhaps it was that understanding that made no one linger long. People looked, then turned away, as though the dog's stare reflected something inside themselves they couldn't bear to face, a guilt they dared not touch. Some may have recognized in a fleeting moment that this creature had been trained, but quickly dismissed the thought, whispering to themselves, "No, it can't be," before moving on. Because to admit the truth would be to acknowledge that this world is often most cruel to its most loyal souls. In truth, Maverick, the name he once answered to, had belonged to a world where loyalty was sacred, and every command carried the weight of life and death. He had been a proud member of the K9 unit, meticulously trained, deeply loved, and treated not as a pet, but a partner. But everything began to unravel on a single fateful day. A routine operation turned nightmare. During a pursuit of an armed suspect, Maverick was shot in the hind leg, a wound that spared his life but stole the agility that had made him legendary. His act of courage saved his handler, Officer Jack Monroe, but it also ended his career. He was meant to retire in the arms of his closest companion. Jack filed the papers, signed every form, even prepared a backyard for Maverick to roam freely without pain. But amidst bureaucratic chaos and overlooked mistakes, Maverick was mistakenly sent to a shelter, one where aging dogs no longer deemed adoptable were quietly tagged for disposal. That's when a man, known only later as the previous owner, came and took Maverick, not out of love, but for his agenda. That man ran an illegal guard dog operation, where dogs were tools, not lives. To him, Maverick was a bargain, obedient, well-trained, and non-aggressive. But what he lacked, and could never understand, was the bond Maverick had once shared with Jack, a spiritual connection that couldn't be bought. When Maverick refused to carry out senseless commands, when he wouldn't bark at innocence, he was labeled useless. And one gloomy morning, the man drove him to a crowded corner, unhooked the leash, gave a shove, and sped off without a word. From that day on, Maverick became a shadow, a ghost with memories, with wounds, but still clutching the last shred of pride that defined a soldier without a battlefield. And that is why, in today's New York rain, he didn't lie down like the others, didn't scavenge trash, didn't fight or whimper. He simply sat, head high, resolute, as if an old command still echoed in his mind, waiting for someone to step forward and say, "Good boy, Maverick, it's time to go home." Perhaps it was because he still waited for someone to call his name that Maverick remained untouched in his heart. Not just a name, but a part of his identity that couldn't be washed away, not by rain, nor hunger, nor the cruel indifference of man. Once, Maverick had been a distinguished K9 officer with the city's police department, part of a rapid response unit trained to apprehend armed suspects and conduct rescue missions. Back then, he wasn't just a dog, he was a teammate, a silent warrior cloaked in charcoal gray fur, moving without a sound beside his handler like a loyal shadow. He had learned to detect explosives in rubble, to chase suspects through dark alleys, and above all, to place his life before others, without hesitation. Maverick had never failed a mission, not until that day. It was a pre-dawn pursuit, the target a dangerous drug trafficker hiding in an abandoned industrial complex. He went in with Jack, his handler, his partner, the only human he trusted with his life. With steady breath and sure-footed steps, he followed the scent of gunpowder and the unmistakable cold sweat of fear. Just meters from the target, Maverick sprinted forward. Then the gunshot rang out. A single bullet tore through the air, piercing his right hind leg and bringing him down just short of the takedown. Jack rushed to pull him to safety, holding him close like a father would a wounded child. And though blood soaked his leg, Maverick lifted his head, not crying out, not whining, just looking at Jack with a question in his eyes. Did I complete the mission? And as always, the answer came in the form of a trembling hand gently stroking his head and a hoarse whisper. Good boy, Maverick. You did well, little soldier. The injury meant Maverick could no longer run like he used to. For a unit that relied on speed and precision, that was a silent sentence. Jack didn't want to let him go. He filed the adoption papers the very next day, signed every form, and wrote every line in shaky handwriting filled with urgency. But in a system riddled with cracks, the paperwork never made it where it needed to go. A forgotten envelope, a missing stamp, or worse, a heartless decision to make room for a stronger candidate. Maverick was sent to a holding shelter, a place where no one knew, no one asked, and no one cared who he used to be. Then he came, the man with greasy hair, a reeking coat stained with cheap smoke and fryer grease, his eyes calculating as though shopping for a used appliance. He didn't ask for documents, didn't want to know Maverick's name, didn't even look into his eyes. He simply saw the dog's large frame, the lingering aura of authority, and nodded. He needed a barking dog to scare off intruders, a cheap guard that didn't require paychecks, papers, or, most of all, loyalty. But Maverick didn't bark on command. He only responded to orders given fairly and with purpose. When the man struck him for refusing to bark, Maverick didn't fight back. He simply stepped away, eyes not angry, but quietly hurt. And when the man realized this dog couldn't earn him anything, he loaded Maverick into a pickup truck, didn't bother with a leash, and didn't say a word. He drove to a crowded corner of Manhattan, stopped beside a butcher's shop with a narrow awning, and nudged the dog onto the wet sidewalk. That was 3 weeks ago. Maverick didn't try to find his way home, because there was no home left to return to. He didn't scratch at police doors, because Jack had no idea where he'd gone. Instead, he simply walked through the loud yet loveless streets, carrying with him a legacy no one remembered and a wound that still hadn't healed. And today, in the cold rain, among 1,000 indifferent stares and hurried footsteps, he sat like a statue of forsaken loyalty, unbroken but forgotten. But that fracture, though unseen at first, began the moment Maverick was taken from Jack Monroe, the one person who had ever seen him as a comrade, not a tool. On the day Jack cradled Maverick in the police vet hospital, the wound on the dog's leg hadn't yet closed, but the anguish in Jack's eyes ran far deeper than any blood spilled. Jack knew Maverick would no longer serve, and he knew, deep in his heart, that this brave soul deserved the peaceful retirement given to every warrior who'd sacrificed their youth for duty. His hands trembling, he filled out the adoption form, reminding the clerk again and again about the deadline, the signature, and where to send the file. He trusted the system. He believed that in just a few more days, Maverick would be sleeping under his porch, eating roast chicken on Sundays, and chasing squirrels through his backyard like any beloved dog. But the system, cold and unfeeling, made no space for love. One unsigned page left in a drawer, one internal memo that never made it to the right desk, one quiet promise crushed by bureaucratic routine. And Maverick was marked retired pending placement. No one called Jack. No one double-checked. By the time Jack returned to check on the adoption progress, Maverick was already gone. He was told the dog had been released to an outside individual, per regulations, and that no violations had occurred. A shrug, a click of a mouse, and Maverick's name vanished from every contact list. Jack stood motionless in the vet clinic parking lot, fists clenched and trembling, from anger, from helplessness, and from a pain only known by those who've lost what matters most. The man who took him, Greg Mallory, lived in the dry outskirts east of the city, and he didn't come out of love or kindness. Behind his shabby auto shop, he ran a makeshift guard dog yard where animals were chained with rusted links and trained through fists, not food. When he saw Maverick's profile marked K9 trained, responds to verbal commands, he smiled. A twisted, soulless grin, as if he'd just snagged a high-end product for a bargain. But what he didn't know, or didn't care to understand, was that Maverick didn't respond to orders from cruel men. He didn't attack without reason. He didn't bark for fear's sake. He didn't move for treats or whips. He had once served out of trust, out of duty, out of love for someone he considered family. In the early days at the new place, Maverick was locked in a rusted cage with no blanket, no clean water, and the deafening cries of other dogs pounding in his ears like a cruel echo. Every morning, Greg would toss in scraps and kick the cage if Maverick didn't bark on cue. And then one day, when Maverick once again refused to bark, refused to lunge at a lost child who had wandered too close, Greg snapped. He opened the cage, looped a leash around Maverick's neck, and dragged him to the truck. No words, no emotion. He drove to the busiest street in Manhattan, where no one had time to care, and parked beside the butcher shop's awning just wide enough to block the rain. He didn't gently unclip the leash. He yanked it, then let go. Maverick slipped on the wet pavement. He turned back to look at the man, not out of longing, but as if to confirm that this was it, that he had officially been discarded. Greg didn't glance back. He started the engine, revved it hard, and disappeared into the gray curtain of rain, leaving behind a creature broken in body and bruised in spirit, sitting silently like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. And from that moment on, Maverick was no longer a soldier waiting for orders. He had become an exile from his own life, carrying a loyalty once celebrated, now the very reason he no longer belonged. And from the moment that pickup truck melted into traffic and vanished, as if it had never existed, Maverick remained where he was, not because he didn't know how to move on, but because deep within, some fragment of his soul refused to let him leave. For Maverick, the absence of a final command meant only one thing. The mission wasn't over. That's why he didn't roam the city like other strays, didn't abandon the spot where he'd been left behind. Instead, he silently continued to await orders, like a loyal ghost not yet released, surviving more on will than instinct. Days bled into nights, and time dissolved into wind and rain. Cold gusts swept in from the Hudson, scattering flyers and tugging at tarps, making people clutch their coats and quicken their pace. But Maverick never moved. He didn't seek shelter, nor did he paw at the shop door for food like other hungry animals might. Sitting upright, front paws together, neck slightly lifted, it wasn't the posture of a beggar. It was the stance of a sentinel still guarding, even when there was no longer a unit to serve. Though he was hungry, he never stole. Though he was cold, he didn't press himself into warmer corners. The wounds on his hind leg would twitch at times, veins swollen from the damp. But Maverick didn't whimper, didn't draw attention to himself, as though invisibility was the only way to preserve the last of his dignity. Each morning, he sat in front of the butcher shop, where the first light of day glinted off the wet pavement. And each afternoon, as the rain returned with relentless rhythm, Maverick remained, drenched but unmoving, eyes following the slices of meat placed on display, not blinking, not reacting, just watching, as if the only thing keeping him alive was the ritual he had been trained for. Observe, be patient, await command. Sometimes other strays would pass by, sniffing around, inching closer. Some were aggressive, rushing in to bite. Others simply wanted the dry space beneath the awning. But Maverick never fought back. He didn't growl, didn't snap. He simply stepped aside, retreating a few feet to a wetter, colder spot, yet still sitting in the same upright position. He wasn't afraid, but he didn't wish to fight either. What made Maverick different was never brute strength, but a loyalty refined into instinct, an instinct that forbade him from competing with the weak, even when he was in pain. In his world, Battle was only for just cause, and only upon command. And now, with no one left to command, he simply sat, as if waiting for a voice from the past to pull him out of the darkness of the present. Occasionally, Greg, the man who once bore the title of new owner, would appear across the street, loitering around a rundown parking lot and a few makeshift vendor stalls. He lived the same careless life, still buying and selling, still revving engines too loud, still chewing gum with a greasy, crude demeanor. Once or twice, he passed the street where Maverick sat. He glanced in the dog's direction, then looked away, perhaps not recognizing him, or worse, simply not caring. Maverick didn't flinch at his gaze, nor did he move forward. He only returned a brief look, no hatred, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had once trusted the wrong man, and that mistake no longer mattered. Passers-by began to notice Maverick's presence, not because he did anything remarkable, but because he had been there for so long. He became part of the scenery, a silent fixture in the chaos of city life. Some felt pity and left scraps of sandwiches. Others looked away, ashamed, and a few scoffed, muttering, "Why hasn't anyone taken him to a shelter?" As if he were a problem to be fixed rather than a soul trying to survive with what dignity remained. Then, one late afternoon, as the rain began to ease and the butcher shop's golden light grew warmer against the misty air, Maverick sat there, for the who knows how many time, and looked up. His ears perked slightly, not because of a sound, but because a gaze had landed on him. Not the usual look of pity or avoidance, but a steady, piercing gaze that seemed to recognize something old, something distant. And perhaps in that single moment, Maverick's fate quietly began to shift. And in that very instant when that gaze met Maverick's silent eyes, the old wooden door of the butcher shop creaked open, groaning wearily in the damp evening, and from within stepped an elderly man, cradling a still steaming bag of fresh meat. It was Thomas, the widowed butcher who lived alone behind the shop, as quiet and unchanging as the space he had maintained for decades. He had planned to close early because of the rain, just another slow, gray day like so many before. But as his eyes swept past the awning, he stopped. Right beneath the dripping canopy was a large, soaked, bony dog, not shivering, not cowering like the abandoned dogs he'd seen countless times. Its gaze stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, Thomas didn't know why he didn't keep walking. The meat in his hands was growing colder, but he stood motionless, staring at the animal as though under a spell. There was no howling, no begging, not even a wag of the tail. The dog simply sat there, eyes unblinking, back straight, a gaze that seemed to pierce through him in a way no dog ever had. There was something strange, something right, a posture too proper, eyes too lucid, no chaos of survival instincts, but a stillness forged over years of discipline, and that struck something tight in his chest. Thomas had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. He had seen hundreds of strays. He had shooed away many mangy dogs rooting through the trash behind his store. He was used to the sight of trembling creatures, eyes wild with hunger, growling over cold bones. But this dog, it was like none of them. It was like a wounded soldier lost in a world that no longer remembered who he was. Thomas lowered his gaze to the dog's front legs, nails chipped, joints red and swollen, yet the posture remained upright, as if still on duty. Then he saw the scars, long and faded down the legs and chest, unmistakable signs of old trauma, and most clearly, the sunken mark on the hind thigh, where flesh had never quite returned after a deep wound. It stirred a memory, a distant night on the battlefield, back when Thomas had served in logistics, the image of a K-9 bolting from the trenches into no man's land, searching for the wounded, returning bloodied but determined. His heart slowed. His grip on the meat loosened. Standing before him was no stray, but a silent witness to the cruelty of forgetting. A soul once belonging to something sacred, something grounded, now stripped of everything, without a word. Thomas didn't know why he felt the ache pressing against his ribs, only that he couldn't look away. In the dog's eyes, the eyes of one who no longer had a master, there was something that mirrored his reflection. A man who once had a family, a purpose, someone to come home to until everything dissolved in one too quiet, too cold winter. Quietly, he placed the bag of meat on the damp tiles, then crouched down, not too close, extending a calloused, knife-worn hand toward Maverick. There was no call, no coaxing, just a simple, hesitant gesture, filled with silent hope, as if he was offering not just food, but a long, unspoken empathy. Maverick didn't retreat, but he didn't leap forward either. He simply tilted his head, ears twitching, eyes locked on the hand, not fearful, not yearning, but evaluating, as if trying to decide whether this gesture, too, would vanish like so many things he had once trusted. And there, among the scents of raw meat, damp rain, and lingering grease from the shop, under the soft buzz of the neon light above, two souls, one lonely old man and one forgotten hero, stood facing each other in a wordless, fragile moment, soaked not in noise, but in something they both hadn't felt in a long time: recognition. In that seemingly casual silence, as Maverick's eyes did not avoid him, in fact, held him with a quiet intensity so deep it was nearly suffocating, Thomas suddenly felt something familiar rising from beneath the layers of memory he thought had long since been buried. It wasn't just a feeling, nor a shallow pity for a thin, abandoned dog left behind in a cold city. It was something far deeper, a trembling in his soul, as if some long-lost bell had rung faintly in the distance, and its echo stirred something he couldn't quite name. Maverick remained motionless, still sitting tall, front legs straight and close together, his neck extended just slightly, head tilted as he looked at Thomas, a posture too deliberate to be coincidence. It was the same posture Thomas had seen years ago when he was a young soldier stationed in a dusty war zone, echoing with the sound of gunfire. He remembered it vividly. One rainy night, his unit was ordered to hold position at a makeshift outpost. It was so cold, sweat had crystallized as salt on their collars. Through the thick mist, he had seen a K9 dog sitting beside a guard. No leash, no commands, just two beings keeping watch in silence. That same posture, that same gaze, that same self-discipline that required no restraint, now stood before his butcher shop, in the heart of noisy New York. He couldn't take his eyes off the animal. Every movement Maverick made, even the slowest blink, the way his ears shifted subtly at the sounds echoing from the street, all carried purposeful awareness, not animal instinct. There was nothing natural about him, not like other strays. He ignored the traffic, flinched at no horns, didn't rush toward food. He simply watched, calculated, took note, like a soldier trained to survive through thought, not panic. Thomas even noticed how Maverick shifted his weight when adjusting posture. Slowly, deliberately, as if he didn't want to make a single unnecessary sound. This wasn't the behavior of a starving stray. This was a warrior, trained to operate in hostile zones. Then he saw the scars, not one or two, but long faded lines running across Maverick's shoulder, flank, and especially his rear left leg, where the muscle had sunken and the joint swelled. Clear signs of an old, untreated wound. Not a bite. Thomas was sure of it. A bullet wound. During his years as a military medic, he had seen far too many injuries like that, and not every dog survived to carry such wounds home. "Oh, God," he muttered under his breath, as a flood of memories returned like a crashing tide. He recalled the image of Mike, his closest friend, cradling a dog named Rambo, their final moment together before the evacuation helicopter arrived too late. The heartbreaking sob of that hardened man when he realized the dog couldn't come with him. Rambo was left behind, and silence forever haunted Mike's eyes afterward. From that day, Thomas understood something deeply. Four-legged warriors were never just dogs. They were comrades. They fought like soldiers, died like soldiers, and, heartbreakingly, they were forgotten like broken tools. And now Maverick, the dog sitting before him, was reliving every image, every loss, every ache Thomas had never truly let go. Perhaps Greg, the man who had once owned Maverick, never understood any of this. He only saw a powerful frame that could serve as a threat. He never saw the eyes that had stared down death without blinking, the feet that had crossed broken ground to search for buried lives, the heart that once beat for someone else. And when Maverick didn't meet his shallow expectations, he threw him away like an old shoe. Thomas realized then. His hand was still extended, unmoving, steady, waiting for even the smallest response. Yet Maverick stayed still, eyes locked onto him, as if reading every wrinkle on his aging face, searching for traces of a former commander, a familiar voice, a reason to trust again. And in that gaze, the gaze of a soldier without a unit, Thomas saw the loneliness he had tried to bury for years, the kind that lingers in those who once belonged to something greater, only to be cast aside without ceremony, as if their presence had never mattered. His chest tightened. All his life, he believed he'd grown used to silence, to death, to loss, and to letting go. But now, in front of those eyes, in front of that posture, he understood some things, no matter how deeply buried, awaken again when someone is quiet enough to listen. And so, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "You're not a stray, are you, kid?" When those words slipped from Thomas's mouth, bursting forth from a place deeper than thought or speech, he knew he wasn't expecting an answer. He was simply admitting something his heart had long known, something his mind had resisted. Maverick's unwavering gaze wasn't one of hunger. It was the look of a soul that had been betrayed, carefully gauging whether another outstretched hand would lead to yet another unearned loss. Thomas realized he too was being assessed, not with suspicion, but with a silence filled with pain and dignity. Perhaps it was that silence that moved him to act, not to rescue, not to redeem, but to prove that trust, no matter how fragile, could still be honored with even the smallest gesture of sincerity. He shifted slightly, his hand still extended, and slowly opened the bag of meat he'd set on the wet tile. The scent of fresh, warm beef drifted into the cool air, not just a smell, but a memory, waking instincts long suppressed. From the bag, he didn't choose scraps. He pulled out a thick, tender slice, the kind he usually saved for his long-time regulars, and gently placed it on his palm. He reached forward again, not pushing it closer, not calling out, just waiting. It wasn't a casual offering. It was a test, not of Maverick, but of himself. Could a creature discarded like trash still accept kindness? And could he, a man who had witnessed so many silent goodbyes, find the courage to begin something fragile again? Maverick didn't move right away. Instead, he dipped his head just slightly, not to stare at the meat, but as if weighing his choice, not through hunger, but through a learned memory. Only take what is given. Only eat when commanded. Only trust if they've earned it. His ears twitched gently, and then his nose began to move, slow, careful inhales, as if unsure the scent was real. His eyes never left Thomas, watching every breath, every flicker of emotion on the man's face, not to detect a trap, but to sense. Will this kindness vanish too, like the rest? Thomas didn't flinch. His hand stayed steady, his eyes unwavering, though his breath began to slow. Not from the cold, but from emotion. He had never imagined that trembling could come from a dog simply standing still. But he knew, more than anyone, that the deepest wounds are those inflicted by betrayal from the very thing we once believed safe. And if Maverick had once believed in a human, only to be discarded like garbage, then his hesitation now wasn't distrust. It was the voice of an old wound whispering, "Will it be different this time?" After a minute that felt as long as an afternoon, Maverick began to move. Slowly. Not rushing, not lunging, just lifting one paw, then another, each step measured like it was testing something sacred. When only a hand's width remained, he stopped. His eyes flicked to the meat, then back to Thomas's face. One last question. Only when he was sure there would be no sudden movement, no scolding voice, no demanding stare. Only then did he lower his head, gently taking the meat between his front teeth, as delicately as if it were a sacred offering. Thomas didn't move. He didn't pull his hand away. He simply watched the act unfold like something far greater than the sale of meat, something weightier than the sum of all his days behind the butcher's counter. The slice was taken with a slowness almost ceremonial, like a ritual, a recognition, the prelude to a long, quiet symphony the two of them would write together. Maverick stepped back after the bite, didn't ask for more, and didn't lick his hand. He simply sat again in his old place and resumed watching, not with suspicion now, but not yet trust either, as if saying with his eyes, "I'll wait and see if you're truly different." And Thomas, with the warmth of the meat still lingering in his palm, bowed his head slightly, as if honoring a ritual no one had ever taught him, a ritual without words, but filled with understanding. Trust is not begged for. It must be offered. And even though Maverick had accepted the piece of meat from Thomas's hand with a quiet reverence, he didn't lower his head to eat it right away like a starving stray would. Instead, he stayed perfectly upright, the meat still resting in his mouth as he chewed slowly, cautiously, each motion deliberate, as if he were measuring every fiber of the flesh more out of wariness than satisfaction. With each subtle movement of his jaw, his eyes flicked back to the man who still sat across from him, unmoving, unhurried, simply observing. And it was that very stillness that made Maverick's eyes all the more alert, as if he had learned, through too many betrayals, that kindness often came with conditions, and generosity was merely a facade waiting to fall. Thomas saw it all. He saw how Maverick ate, not with desperation, not with panic, and recognized the unease the dog was trying to hide. This wasn't how a hungry animal responded to food. This was how a betrayed soul tested the new limits of its world. There was something in that slowness, in those watchful eyes, that stirred a strange ache in Thomas, as if he were seeing a version of himself, sitting alone years ago in a dim apartment after the army, staring wide-eyed into the dark, not because of nightmares, but because he no longer knew what tethered him to the world. And just like he had once withdrawn behind invisible walls, Maverick too was drawing a silent circle around himself, one that anyone who stepped into would be measured against the memories of broken trust. Maverick finished the first piece, then stopped. He didn't look up to ask for more, didn't move closer. His head dipped slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on Thomas, tracking even the smallest of movements, as if any sudden shift might signal danger. Thomas said nothing, just let out a long, quiet sigh. He understood. That small act, that first bite, wasn't enough to undo the wandering years, wasn't enough to mend the deep wounds of a creature once trained to trust, to serve, and then discarded like something used up. And when he recalled a story shared by someone who had worked in a training center, "Some retired K9s won't eat without a command. They don't understand the mission's over." The realization struck him hard. Maybe Maverick had been waiting all this time for that final command, waiting until his hope simply wore out. Greg, the heartless man who once owned him, likely never grasped that the dog he abandoned wasn't just an animal, but a soldier molded to fight for people, not against them. Maverick was never meant to be some decoration under a stairwell or a tool to snarl behind fences. Greg never had the patience to look into Maverick's eyes, nor the compassion to ask the question that Thomas now held trembling in his chest. Why would a creature so powerful choose silence over violence? And that ignorance, that shallowness, made him lose something that Thomas had only just begun to touch, but already felt as real as the ground beneath him. This wasn't a stray dog. This was a soldier without a war, a soul without a name. Thomas slowly raised his hand, and stroked his graying beard. Not from the cold, but to steady his emotions. He hadn't expected that such a silent creature could stir such a storm in his chest. And then, as if moved by something greater than pity, he bent down again to the bag of meat. This time he didn't reach out to offer it by hand. He took another small piece, just the right size, and gently placed it on the damp ground between him and Maverick. Not as an offering, not as bait, but as a quiet pact. No pressure, no expectations. Just a silent message. If you're ready, I'm still here. I won't leave like the others did. Maverick glanced at the second piece, then looked back at Thomas. This time his gaze wasn't cold, but it wasn't yet warm. It was distant, as though he were looking through the man in front of him, searching for a memory blurred by time. And in that gaze, Thomas saw something words could never explain, that Maverick had once been loved, once had a home, once had someone whose call could send him into fire without hesitation. But now no one called anymore, and so he didn't rush to believe again. And just as that gaze lingered in the foggy drizzle beneath the pale shop light, a faint sound broke the silence, the soft clink of metal striking metal at the far end of the street. It was barely audible, but it sliced through the quiet like a blade. In a split second, too quick for the eye to catch, Maverick's body tensed, ears snapping upright, neck extending instinctively, and his weight shifted forward, ready to lunge. The entire reaction lasted less than a heartbeat. But for Thomas, a man who had once lain still in jungles under fire, motionless at the rustle of a single branch, it was enough. He knew immediately. That reflex didn't come from fear. It came from training. Maverick didn't bark, he didn't leap, he didn't growl. He simply became stone. Still, eyes fixed on the source of the sound, legs taut and coiled for action, yet body anchored in perfect control. No panic, no confusion. This was a conditioned response, precise, measured, and entirely tactical. And in that one frozen moment, Thomas no longer needed proof. No files, no tags, and no one to confirm. He had seen it before. The stance, the stillness, the micro-movements that separated K9 units from every other dog. This was the mark of hours upon hours of training, reflexes etched into the bones, held even after the mission had ended, the war forgotten, and the name erased. Thomas clenched his hands on his knees, feeling a chill rise along his spine. Not from the rain, but from the truth now quietly unraveling before him. "You were a police dog," he whispered, not a question but a statement, spoken from the deep recesses of his heart, from the place where honor is kept for those who were never allowed to speak, yet always the first to face danger. And the moment those words left his mouth, Maverick turned his head, not in response to the sound itself, but because something had changed. His eyes softened only slightly, but Thomas saw it, as if Maverick had understood, as if something inside him had stirred, the echo of commands once trusted, once followed without hesitation. Sit, hold, guard. Voices he had once obeyed without question, voices he would have died for. And as Thomas sat there, overwhelmed by the rush of memory and realization, Greg's image returned like a dull blade scraping across his thoughts. That careless man had once held this extraordinary being, and tossed him aside as if he were a malfunctioning tool. He had never seen the discipline buried in every step. He had never understood the cost of creating a maverick, the sweat, the sleepless hours, the belief that shaped him. Greg hadn't just discarded a dog. He had wasted a soul once built from loyalty and purpose. Thomas felt his chest tighten, not just from sorrow or anger, but from something far deeper, the realization that the being before him was no longer just a discarded animal waiting for pity. Number what stood there now was a disoriented veteran, a soldier once trained to serve with unwavering purpose, now left with no one to follow. And Thomas knew, with painful clarity, that this was the wound that cut the deepest, not the hunger, not the cold, but the hollow silence left behind when there was no longer anyone to be loyal to, no one to protect, no human left who was worthy of such fierce, unshakable trust. "You're still waiting for an order, aren't you?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. And for the first time, Maverick's eyes seemed to flicker, not out of fear, not exactly from recognition, but from something deeper, something stirred in the quiet corners of his memory. Maybe he no longer remembered the voice of his old handler. Maybe the images of those proud days had faded, but his body remembered. His mind remembered. And now, sitting in front of him was a man who didn't bark commands, didn't push him away, didn't force anything. Just sat there in silence, offering a quiet kind of understanding. In that moment, the instincts of a retired K-9, instincts once trained for obedience and duty, became something else, a fragile but miraculous bridge between two lonely souls. A single flinch, a single glance, and the distance between them began to close. And it was in that fleeting flicker of Maverick's gaze, hovering between instinct and memory, that Thomas knew he couldn't move forward like the others had. He couldn't give orders, couldn't call out, couldn't force anything. What Maverick needed wasn't a voice to obey, but space to choose. Not a leash behind an open door, but the door itself, quietly ajar. Thomas reached behind him, hand brushing the cold grain of the butcher shop's back door, closed since they'd arrived, and gently nudged it. No creak, no sharp motion. Just enough for it to open a crack, just enough for warm light to spill out onto the damp brick ground and slowly creep toward Maverick's trembling paws. There was no invitation, no command. Not a word broke the stillness between the old man and the forgotten dog. Thomas stayed where he was, arms resting at his sides, eyes never lingering too long, afraid that expectation might turn into pressure. He knew, a warrior like Maverick, raised inside the rigid walls of obedience, he needed silence to make his first real choice. And maybe that choice, though painful, would be the freest he'd ever made. Maverick didn't move. Not yet. He stared at the open door like it was something sacred and suspicious all at once. The light spilling out was warm, like the scent of safety he'd long lost and no longer dared to run toward. He lowered his head, not in fear, but caution, as if bracing for a stick, a kick, a cold voice snapping at him to leave, like all the other times he'd stepped where he wasn't allowed. But nothing came. Just the breeze brushing past Thomas's worn coat, and the light, patient and steady, painting the pavement without insistence, without retreat, like the man's own quiet offering, unwavering, undemanding, undeserved. Thomas remained still, watching, not commanding. And maybe for the first time in years, he realized he didn't need to speak to be heard, didn't need to hold on to keep someone close. He only needed to open the door and wait. Because if Maverick walked through, it wouldn't be out of training or habit. No echo of heel or in position would be guiding him. It would be his first real decision since being discarded. A choice made from trust, not orders. Maverick shifted. Barely. One front paw moved forward, then paused. He looked up at Thomas again, the steel caution in his eyes now clouded with something harder to name. Doubt, curiosity, and the faintest flicker of hope. And as that gaze met Thomas's, silent, still, offering no push, just waiting, Maverick slowly set his paw down on the brick. The sound was so soft it might have been lost to the wind, but to Thomas it rang louder than words. He took another step, then one more. Light began to wrap around his soaked, dark fur, illuminating a body once proud, now bowed, but moving forward. Not pulled, not pushed, just welcomed. When the door finally swung fully open, Maverick stopped at the threshold. He didn't go all the way in, but he didn't turn back either. He stood there, caught between past and future, between shadow and warmth, between memory and something like hope. And for the first time in his life, he understood. No one was telling him what to do. No command, no restraint, just an old man who opened a door and waited. like he'd been waiting for him all along. And so, after lingering at the edge of everything he'd ever known, loss, fear, duty, Maverick tilted his head. His ears twitched at the street's cold whistle. Then, as if the whole world held its breath, he stepped over the threshold. His paw touched the worn wood floor of the butcher shop, a space filled with the scent of raw meat, spices, and a kind of warmth that lived in the cracks of ordinary things. The step made no sound. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. But for Thomas, a man who had outlived comrades, buried his wife, and watched his son leave without ever crying, that moment tightened something deep inside his chest. It felt like witnessing a silent miracle. Maverick didn't sniff around like a curious dog. He didn't explore. He walked just a few steps in, then stopped under the soft yellow light, his drenched coat casting a long, blurry shadow across the floor, like his own life, real but smudged by time and wounds. He didn't shake the rain off, didn't lie down, just stood there, breathing in quietly, as if even he couldn't believe where he was. A place with no harsh commands, no cold stares, no sharp voices or tight collars. No one needed him to perform. No one asked what he could do to earn his place. Thomas said nothing. He stayed by the half-open door, fingers gripping the frame as if holding back the wave rising in his chest. He didn't move toward Maverick. Didn't close the door. Didn't clap like people do when a dog behaves. Because he knew this wasn't obedience. It wasn't instinct. It was the outcome of a war waged within Maverick's soul. Not just in the few seconds outside, but over years of being lost in a world he once thought he belonged to. Crossing that threshold wasn't simple. It was a quiet declaration. I'm willing to try again, even if the hope is thin as air. Behind them, the shop's lights glowed faintly on the few cuts of meat left on the hooks. The place wasn't bustling. Just the low hum of the fridge, the gentle spin of the exhaust fan, and the steady breath of a man watching a creature he never expected to walk through his door. Thomas wasn't the sentimental type. After his wife died, after his son left, he'd trained himself not to expect anyone to stay. But the way Maverick entered, slow, scarred, but still proud, made him feel like he was witnessing something rare, the quiet return of trust. Greg, the man who once saw Maverick as an expired asset, would never understand the weight of that step. To him, Maverick was just a failed dog. Didn't bark on command, didn't attack on cue, didn't perform tricks for approval. But what Greg never understood, and maybe never deserved to, was that some beings aren't meant to please. They exist to fulfill quiet missions no one sees, but are carried in every breath, every step, every look that never wavers from the one they trust. And Maverick, even after betrayal, had never lost that core, the heart of a soldier waiting to be called home. Not with a whistle, but with presence. A promise not to be abandoned. Thomas bent slowly, pulling a clean towel from the bottom shelf, still warm from use earlier that afternoon. He laid it down near the electric heater, not directly in front of Maverick, but just off to the side, a space warm enough to dry rain, quiet enough to feel safe. No words, no extra gestures, just presence. Then he turned, walked back to the counter, resumed wiping knives, stacking boxes, as if Maverick's arrival wasn't extraordinary, but natural, as if this was how it was always supposed to be. After standing still for a long while, Maverick finally lay down. Not curled up, not guarded. He stretched out, rested his head on the wooden floor, and closed his eyes, half-lidded, not out of full trust, but out of a quiet choice to rest. Because maybe, just for tonight, no one would make him leave. And just like that, one step, one open door, one invitation without a single word, and the entire world inside Maverick began to shift. And just as Maverick rested his head on the wooden floor for the first time, eyes slowly closing in a haze between exhaustion and half-sleep, far from the blaring horns and the reek of alley trash, across the street, In a second-floor apartment above the bakery, another pair of eyes quietly watched. Behind a thin blue curtain, an 8-year-old girl with tousled blonde hair and a small, questioning face pressed her forehead to a fogged-up window, gazing down at the strange creature lying still inside Thomas's butcher shop. Her name was Emily, the granddaughter of old Mrs. Agnes on the ground floor, the woman who had lived next to the shop for 30 years and never missed a chance to complain about delivery trucks blocking the path. Emily was also the same girl who had once screamed until her lips turned blue when a stray dog bit her hand at the park last summer. Since that day, Emily had feared all dogs, big or small, leashed or not. In her young memory, dogs meant bared teeth and growls that echoed through nightmares. Every time she walked past a yard with a dog, she would hide behind an adult or cling to her mother's handbag, eyes shut tight as if just looking might make the fear real again. But tonight, from the safety of her high window, she saw something that made her freeze. The shop door had creaked open in the rain, and a large dog stepped in. No leash, no owner, no commands. And yet, something in the way it moved stopped her breath. It didn't drag its paws. It didn't sniff around with chaotic curiosity. It didn't bark, jump, or act wild like the dogs that haunted her. It was quiet, almost sad, and strangely polite. Emily leaned closer to the glass, her small hands pressed against the wooden frame, as if trying to understand something beyond words. Under the warm yellow shop lights, Maverick's dark fur was still soaked and matted from the rain, but he didn't look dirty or dangerous like the strays she remembered. He didn't curl up in fear or spring forward in threat. He lay gently on his side, legs stretched out, head resting on his front paw, eyes half closed, not quite asleep, but not alarmed either. It was that calm, so human, so measured, that held Emily's gaze. Of course, she was still afraid. Her small heart still pounded at the thought that the dog might leap up, bolt out, do something sudden. But for the first time, inside that fear, something else stirred. Curiosity. Not the playful curiosity of a child, but a quiet question. Why is this dog different? Mrs. Agnes, who always warned Emily to steer clear of those filthy mutts on the street, had no idea that right now her granddaughter was silently watching a creature who, not long ago, would have sent her running in tears. But Emily, with a mind still tender yet surprisingly perceptive, began to sense something sorrowful in the way this animal simply lay there, asking for nothing, disturbing no one. Like an uninvited guest trying not to take up space, Thomas had no idea that a young girl was watching Maverick from across the street. And Maverick, more used to closed doors and turned backs, didn't know that his quiet presence was slowly nudging open the tightly shut heart of a child. And so, the first night inside the small butcher shop became more than just the start of a second chance for a dog cast aside by the world. It also planted the first seed of something new inside a little girl. Someone who, though she didn't know it yet, would one day become a vital part of the healing journey that neither she nor Maverick ever saw coming. While Emily still stood at her window, forehead pressed to the glass, torn between fear and fascination, the scene inside the butcher shop remained still. Thomas didn't say a word. He knelt quietly, pulling a thick towel from the back shelf, the kind he usually kept to wipe away blood and scraps at the end of the day. Now it was clean, dry from the morning sun, and carefully folded. He placed it in a corner near the electric heater. No hand gestures, no coaxing, no soothing words like people often use to calm dogs. Every move Thomas made was slow and simple, as if he were sharing space with a soul that needed no language, only the safety to exist without being pushed away again. Maverick watched the towel for a few moments. He didn't rush toward it. He simply lifted his head, those deep, cautious eyes tracking every motion of the man who had opened the door for him. But when he saw that Thomas only laid the towel down, then stood up and quietly returned to cleaning his knives. Maverick slowly inched toward the corner. The faint click of his claws on the wood floor barely registered, yet each step seemed to thicken the air, as if someone in the room had stopped breathing, afraid to shatter the fragile peace. He lowered his nose to the edge of the towel, not to sniff, but as if to test whether kindness could be real or whether it would vanish the moment he let his guard down. And then he lay down, not in the guarded, curled-up way of a dog sleeping rough under concrete awnings, not half ready to spring up at the first sound. This time, he stretched out fully, paws forward, head resting gently on the towel, chest rising in a steady rhythm. His eyes closed, not completely, but enough to show that he no longer needed them wide open just to survive. It was the first time in weeks, maybe months, that Maverick didn't have to sleep on cold stone. The first time he didn't have to watch every shadow, every step, fearing a boot or a shout. The first time, sleep was more important than survival. Thomas watched from behind the counter, eyes narrowing, not from weariness, but to hold back a feeling he hadn't let touch him in a long time. He knew that lying down wasn't just rest. It was trust, a silent response to everything Thomas had done. The door left open, the towel laid down, the absence of any demands, and something inside him cracked, small, quiet, but enough to remind him the shop wasn't cold tonight. Not because the heater was on, but because something once abandoned was breathing quietly within its walls, warming the space just by being allowed to stay. Outside, night fell like a thin blanket over the rooftops. Rain tapped gently on Emily's window. She still hadn't looked away from Maverick, and she didn't know why, but somehow, watching him made her feel safe. Inside, Thomas put away his knives, dimmed the lights, leaving only the soft golden glow near the heater. He turned toward the narrow staircase leading to the loft above. Before leaving the counter, he glanced back one last time, and there Maverick was, unmoved, ears twitching faintly with the hum of the ceiling fan, as if, for the first time, he could finally sleep without counting the seconds until something chased him awake. It rained all night, but inside that old butcher shop, it was no longer cold, at least not for two souls who had once believed there was nowhere left to go. As the rain outside softened into a steady rhythm, like the slow breathing of the night, Maverick finally sank into deep sleep, not the strained, restless kind he had known through months of cold and hunger, but real sleep, the kind that arrives when the body no longer has to stay tense, and the mind no longer teeters on the edge of alarm. And in that rare peace, memories began to surface, distant but vivid, like an old reel of film rewinding on its own, soft and flickering, soaked in the weight of everything that had once been pride and purpose. In his dream, Maverick was wearing his K9 vest again, the nameplate on his collar light but meaningful. He stood beside his handler in a narrow alley, shrouded in the presence of officers. He was sniffing for explosives, the metallic scent laced with strange chemicals filtering through his trained senses, alerting him to danger. When he sat by a rattling old mailbox, the entire team fanned out instantly, reacting as one, putting their trust in the instincts of a four-legged soldier. Then, the scene shifted. He was guiding an elderly blind woman across a post-fire evacuation zone, weaving through panicked crowds, sirens wailing. His steps were firm, steady, like an anchor in chaos. Another memory. Maverick crashing through a glass storefront, intercepting a knife-wielding thief who had cornered a child. The glass shattered like a gunshot, and he growled, not to bite, but to control. He gripped the attacker's wrist just enough to immobilize until the officers swarmed in. Every mission ended the same. No treats, no tricks, just a pat on the back, a quiet, "Good job, old boy," and a look of pride that told him everything. He had a purpose. He was meant to protect. But then the sky in his memory turned hazy, like smoke smeared across a painting. The sirens faded. A blank, aching silence took over, and Maverick found himself chasing an armed suspect with Jack, his closest partner, through an abandoned warehouse. Footsteps echoed against brick walls, and the air filled with sweat, oil, and rust. Then a sudden movement. Maverick leapt, made contact, and then the explosion. A searing flash, a deafening crack, pain burning up from his hind leg, seizing his whole side in fire. What followed was a blur, Jack shouting into his radio, the scrape of body armor on a stretcher, the sharp sting of disinfectant, and the sterile white glare of an operating room. Maverick didn't know how long it was before he woke up, only that when he did, there was no familiar voice, no Jack, no vest, just a loose leash tied to a cold metal fence, and a stranger muttering, "This one's no use anymore." In his sleep, Maverick flinched, his leg tucking in as if the old wound still throbbed. But unlike those long nights on the street, he didn't jolt awake. The heat from the nearby heater hummed softly beside him. Beneath him, the towel was dry and warm. Above him, the still air held no threat. The dream didn't vanish, but this time its ending wasn't the sterile white of a surgery lamp. It was the gentle yellow of a butcher shop's nightlight, a place where someone had opened a door without giving a command. And even as Maverick lay half-dreaming, his tail moved, just a small flick, the reflex of a soldier who had once fallen but never truly surrendered. Maverick was still caught between dream and waking, his breath slow and even in the warmth of the room, when something in the air changed. Not a sound, exactly, but a sensation, deeply familiar and impossible to forget. The scent of danger, that unmistakable charge that no years of sleep could erase. Then, a loud bang on the door, too forceful, too sudden. The metal wind chime clattered against the frame, and a man's voice, hoarse, urgent, angry, tore through the quiet like glass through silence. "Stay down, old man. Open the safe." Thomas stumbled backward, his hand slamming into the counter, knocking knives and trays to the ground with a crash. Maverick snapped awake. No hesitation, no thought, just instinct firing like it always had. Muscle memory honed from years of training. His paws hit the wooden floor silently. No bark, no warning, just a blur of motion, swift and powerful. Even he didn't realize how much strength had returned to his body. His eyes locked on the intruder's knife, raised toward Thomas, and something inside him clicked into place. Not memory, presence. The man barely had time to react. The knife was halfway up when Maverick's weight hit him square in the chest, slamming him to the ground. No bite. That wasn't Maverick's way. He pinned the man's arms, locking his forelegs over the elbows, holding, not harming. The weapon clattered across the floor, skidding until it stopped near the butcher's block. Thomas froze, hand on his chest, his heart thundering, stunned by what he was seeing. Get off me!" the man shouted, thrashing wildly. Maverick didn't move, didn't snarl, didn't shake, just held, just enough, just right. Like all those times he had been told, "Hold the suspect, do not release until command is given." He wasn't remembering. He was doing dot, he was back. And in his eyes, sharp, steady, it was clear. This time, no one was being left behind. Thomas, still shaking, stepped closer, hand gripping the counter to stay steady. His other hand reached out, touched Maverick's back, not to pull, but simply to thank. "Easy, it's okay now, son," he said softly, voice tight with emotion. Not just because he'd been saved, but because, in that moment, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Less than 5 minutes later, police sirens wailed down the quiet street. 2 young officers burst in, weapons drawn, then stopped cold. On the floor, a heavy-set man, subdued and gasping, a knife beside him. And in front of the counter, a German shepherd, sitting alert, unmoving, beside an old man, muscles coiled, ears high, eyes clear. Ready, but calm. "Everything okay here?" the taller officer asked, still wary. Thomas nodded. placing a steady hand on Maverick's head. "He saved me," he said quietly but firmly. "No hesitation. No need for more." "Wait, he did what?" The second officer blinked, staring at the dog who looked as if he hadn't just taken down a man with a knife. "He stopped him. Didn't bite, didn't panic, just held him," Thomas said, a small smile creeping into his tired face. "I think he used to be K9. The officers exchanged a look. One spoke into his radio, requesting verification on a retired K9 unit. "We might have a match. Please check old ID numbers." Maverick, still sitting close to Thomas, tilted his head slightly at the sound of the radio. Not reacting, but listening, his ears perked, sharp and focused, because this time, though there was no vest, no handler, no command, there was trust. And somehow, that was more than enough. When news of the robbery at the small butcher shop in Brooklyn spread across local papers, with a simple but arresting headline, "Stray Dog Saves Butcher from Armed Robber," in a quiet office of the NYPD's K9 division, a man sat frozen, staring at the photo attached to the article. It showed a German shepherd with sharp, focused eyes, sitting silently beside an elderly butcher on worn, time-stained tiles. Jack Monroe's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to zoom in, didn't need to think twice. One look was enough. It was him. It was Maverick. There was no mistaking it. Even if the years had dulled the color of his fur, slowed his steps, or deepened the sorrow in his gaze, Jack knew that look. The way he sat, the way he held just enough distance to protect without threatening, that was unmistakable. That was his partner. The same dog who had followed him through dozens of life-or-death missions, narcotics raids, collapsed building rescues, endless stakeouts. The same dog who had once licked blood from his hand after a bombing, who had disobeyed a retreat command to pull a little girl out of a burning zone. The same warrior Jack had once sworn to never leave behind, until the day fate did it for him. Jack remembered that day with painful clarity, the day his adoption request for Maverick was misplaced in the bureaucracy. They told him Maverick had gone to a new family, that he'd be safe, have a peaceful home. But when Jack pressed for details, the answers vanished. Files sealed, records unclear. He had wanted to tear the department apart to get to the truth, but was urged to back off. "He's just a dog, Monroe, let it go." But Jack had never seen Maverick as just a dog. He was a teammate, a friend, the only soul who'd ever listened to Jack when no one else did. And now, after all those years, Maverick was back, not in a ceremonial honor list, not in a K9 memorial service, but in a butcher shop, wounded, gaunt, and saving lives as if that instinct had never faded. "God, you're alive," Jack whispered, fingers tightening on the wrinkled paper where someone had scribbled "Maverick" beneath the photo, the question mark still bold. But Jack didn't need to question. Even if the world didn't know who he was, Jack did. The very next morning, Jack filed for leave. He searched the internal system, tracking every location, every report tied to the incident. The shop owner's name popped up: Thomas Harrington. The local precinct hadn't removed the dog. Not dangerous, currently stable. But Jack couldn't wait. He didn't want to bring Maverick back. He just needed to look him in the eyes and say, "I'm sorry it took me this long." Driving through the light morning rain, Jack couldn't help but remember the last time he stroked Maverick's head. Just after surgery, when the dog was still groggy, one ear twitching faintly at his voice. If Maverick was still alive, if any part of that memory still lived inside him, maybe he would remember. And Jack knew, even if the odds were 1,000 to 1, he had to try. Because loyalty like Maverick's should never be forgotten. While Jack Monroe searched for the four-legged friend who had shared both the brightest and most broken years of his life, a quieter story, unnoticed by police reports or headlines, was quietly unfolding just across the street from that butcher shop. It involved two unlikely companions: a dog once abandoned and a child haunted by fear. Emily, the 8-year-old girl who lived with her grandmother in the apartment above the bakery, had avoided dogs ever since one attacked her in the park. It didn't matter if the dog was small and on a leash or fluffy and asleep behind a pet shop window. To her, all dogs were unpredictable, dangerous, and capable of harm without reason. No amount of adult reassurance or therapy sessions could undo what her fear had turned into, a wall. But something began to shift the night of the rain. The night she saw a large German shepherd walk into the butcher shop alone, with no leash, no owner, no barking, no lunging, no digging through trash. Something cracked, barely noticeable, but there. First came curiosity. Then quiet questions whispered to Grandma Agnes. Where did that dog come from? Does he bite? Why doesn't he bark? Before long, it became a morning ritual. Each day, Emily stood by her window, watching the dog, Maverick, as he sat calmly at the shop's doorway. His posture was regal, alert, but never tense, as if guarding not just the shop but something deeper, perhaps a past he hadn't yet let go of. What pulled Emily in wasn't charm. It was silence. Maverick didn't try to be cute. He didn't beg for attention. He didn't chase pigeons or wag like the neighbors' yappy pets. He simply was. Solid. Present. As if he understood time was necessary. And he was willing to wait. Then, one day, when Grandma Agnes stopped by Thomas's shop to pick up stewed meat, Emily paused just inside the doorway. Maverick lay on an old rug, head resting against the leg of a chair. He didn't move, didn't even open his eyes. Thomas nodded in greeting, smiling gently. Perfect weather for stew, huh? Emily said nothing, but she kept watching. Her gaze, once filled with dread, now brimmed with questions. After that, Emily began leaving little offerings by the shop door. Half a sausage from breakfast, a bone-shaped biscuit her mom had bought by mistake, a soft caramel she didn't like. She never left them too close, always at a distance, and ran off before anyone could see. Maverick, patient as ever, never rushed to grab them. He waited, always waited. Only when she was gone would he rise, walk over, and take the gift gently, like a soldier humbly accepting a peace treaty. Then came the moment everything changed. One afternoon, while walking through the park with her grandmother, a small, unleashed dog came bounding toward Emily, chasing butterflies. For most kids, it would be nothing. But for Emily, the world stopped. Panic took over. She let go of Grandma's hand, stumbling back, body frozen. The dog, playful but loud, barked sharply. Emily clutched her ears, bracing for the worst. And then Maverick appeared. No one knew how he got loose. No one saw him slip out. But within 30 seconds, he was there, placing himself squarely between Emily and the approaching dog. His body was taut, his stance firm, no barking, just one deep growl. The little dog stopped cold, turned, and trotted off. Emily trembled. But when she looked up and saw that dog, the one who always sat quietly by the butcher's door, now standing in front of her like a living shield, she didn't run, she didn't scream. She reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and touched his back. Her fingers shook, but they didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Maverick stayed still. Then, gently, he turned his head and gave her hand a soft lick. Not asking for food, just saying, "You're safe now." From that day on, Emily stopped avoiding him. Every afternoon she sat beside Maverick outside the shop, reading aloud from picture books, sharing little thoughts from her day. Sometimes she said nothing, just leaned against him, eyes closed, as if his steady breath made the world less frightening. And Maverick, with all his scars and silence, discovered something he had never known before, that he too could heal someone. Not with teeth, not with force, but simply by being there. Just as the fragile thread of healing between Emily and Maverick had begun to reach the deepest scars, just as Thomas had grown used to waking every morning to find the loyal shepherd curled quietly on the wooden porch, just as Maverick finally learned that waiting didn't have to mean awaiting orders, but simply being part of a home. Trouble returned. This time it didn't come with knives or barking. It came dressed in a sharply pressed suit, a smug voice, and a stamped red document slammed down on the butcher's counter like a verdict. That morning was colder than usual. The sky was gray, the wind biting early. A sleek black car pulled up in front of the shop. Out stepped a man in his 50s, angular face, eyes like polished steel. Thomas recognized the name from the police report. Greg Hanley. The man who had once adopted Maverick after Jack Monroe's application, mysteriously, went missing. The same man, according to official notes, who refused to return the dog when the mix-up was uncovered, until the case was dropped and Maverick was forgotten. Greg walked into the shop like he owned it. His eyes scanned the room, narrowing the moment they landed on Maverick, who was lying peacefully near the door. Behind him trailed a younger man in a tailored suit, briefcase in hand. A lawyer. Thomas, standing behind the counter, tensed. And Maverick, at the first glimpse of Greg, stood up abruptly. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. But he took a step back, ears flat, body taut. Not from fear of punishment, but from the deeper instinct that told him this wasn't danger in the form of violence, but betrayal disguised in human skin. "Still obedient, huh?" Greg sneered, voice light but dripping with disdain. "Looks like he remembers how to sit." He smirked at the lawyer, then slapped a folder down onto the counter. His voice turned louder. "I'm here to reclaim my dog. He's still chipped under my name. I have the registration, and it's certified. Legally, he's my property." Thomas's hand clenched against the countertop. His heart pounded with disbelief and anger. He looked at Maverick, who no longer trembled like he had that first day, but whose eyes still carried the ache of ghosts long buried, now rising again. Greg stepped closer, shoving the documents forward like charges being read. "If you refuse, I'll sue. This is unlawful possession, and for your information, my lawyer is preparing the paperwork. I have no problem taking this to court." Thomas let out a cold breath, not from fear, but fury. He looked this man, this coward who had once discarded a living soul, square in the face. "He's your property, huh?" he said, each word cutting like a blade. "Then why did you starve him? Leave him out in the cold? Let him wander the streets until his ribs showed? If he was your property, you threw him away like garbage." Greg shrugged, his smirk widening. "Spare me the tears, old man. Whether I forgot to feed him or tossed him in the rain, he's still mine. The law doesn't care about dog emotions." His lawyer, stiff and cold, stepped in. "You have 3 days to respond. After that, we'll proceed with civil action. I suggest you speak with a lawyer." And with that, the door slammed shut behind them. Maverick stood frozen. No whining, no movement, just staring at the space Greg had filled, now empty again, as if remembering too much all at once. Thomas knelt beside him, hand gently stroking his head, both to comfort the dog and to steady himself. "We're not letting him take you," he whispered. "Not without a fight. Not even if we have to take on the whole damn system." From her second-floor window, Emily had seen everything. She hadn't heard the words, but she saw Maverick's eyes, those same eyes she once feared, now filled with worry and dread. Her heart trembled with his, because she understood now Maverick wasn't just a dog. He was the friend who'd pulled her out of the shadow of fear. And now he was facing a different kind of darkness, not fear, but injustice. Just 3 days after Greg Hanley's cold visit and veiled threat, before the tension in the butcher shop could settle, the worst happened. Not with yelling, not with court documents, but with 2 uniformed officers at the door, mid-afternoon, wearing guilt on their faces and carrying a legal order they couldn't refuse. Maverick was to be detained pending a legal ruling. Thomas had just stepped out of the back room with a tray of freshly cut meat. He froze. The younger officer met his eyes, softened with regret, and after a long exhale, said, "We're sorry, Mr. Harrington. We have to take the dog in. The claimant has submitted official ownership documentation." Thomas said nothing. He gently set the tray down, wiped his hands on his apron as if trying to stretch out the moment. Maverick, lying near the fireplace rug, raised his head slowly at the sound of boots on wood. He didn't bark, didn't run. He just looked, calm, but unbearably sad. like someone who knew this moment was coming, like someone who had already accepted that once again they'd be taken, not for doing wrong, but because no one saw the worth in them. Emily came running across the street, breathless and desperate. "Wait, what are you doing?" "He didn't do anything," she cried, grabbing the sleeve of the younger officer, her eyes already red, her voice trembling with panic. Maverick lifted himself slightly, trying to move toward her, but Thomas placed a steadying hand on his back, not to stop him, but to keep him grounded. The older officer stepped forward, shaking his head gently. "We don't want to do this, sir. It's just a temporary hold until ownership is verified. He'll be safe. There's food, medical care. We promise." But promises meant little to a soul who had been betrayed by the very species that made them. As Maverick was led to the door, he didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He walked with the quiet composure of a soldier being stripped of his rank, not for failure, but for being misunderstood. When he passed Emily, she couldn't speak. She just reached out, her tiny hands trembling as she held onto a tuft of fur left on her sleeve from yesterday's hug. "Maverick, don't go," she whispered, her voice cracking like glass under pressure. Thomas stood on the threshold, unmoving. He didn't stop them. He knew he couldn't. But his eyes, as they watched Maverick disappear into the back of the patrol car, were no longer the eyes of a butcher. They were the eyes of a father losing his son. A comrade is watching his brother pulled from the trench. A man who once believed justice could hear the silent cries of the voiceless. And Maverick, as the door of the cruiser shut with a soft, cruel click, looked back. Not in fear, not for orders, but as if burning into memory the image of what had almost been his home. The soft light of the butcher shop, the towel by the fire, Thomas's weathered face filled with silent resolve, and the tearful eyes of a little girl, all vanishing behind glass and steel. And so, in this crowded city, once again, Maverick was taken once again. Not because he did wrong, however, because some rights still have no law to protect them. After the police car doors closed and took Maverick away from the only place he had dared to trust in years, it wasn't just Emily who cried in the middle of the street, or Thomas who sat for hours in silence by an empty rug. Something stirred across the entire quiet neighborhood, as if an invisible thread connecting people to a once-forgotten dog had been pulled taut, demanding to be heard. The story of Maverick spread fast, not through major news outlets, but through whispers over coffee at the corner cafe, in the flower shop where Mrs. Janet arranged her roses, in the everyday chatter of loyal butcher shop customers. Everyone was talking about the large, silent German shepherd, the one who'd saved the butcher from a knife-wielding robber who had stood between a frightened little girl and a charging stray. And then, on the very next afternoon, while the air in Thomas's shop still felt thick like old smoke clinging to the kitchen walls, Jack Monroe appeared. He didn't rush in, didn't shout. He simply stood at the door, no longer in uniform, but in a worn leather jacket, clutching a weathered folder. On its spine, the paper was yellowed, the edges frayed, but the stamped red ink was still clear. K9 Tactical File, Unit Maverick, Code 849ZR. Jack didn't need to ask. The look in Thomas's eyes told him everything. They were on the same side now. That evening, a community meeting was called in the common room of the building across the street. Thomas spoke first, still in his apron, hands stained faintly red from half-finished butchering. He stood tall before the room full of neighbors, eyes sharp with the steadiness of an old soldier. He told them everything. The night Maverick arrived in the rain, not barking, not begging, just waiting. He spoke of how Maverick saved him from a robber, how he never begged for food, never made a mess, and simply lay by the fire each night like he belonged there. Then, Emily stepped up beside him, clutching a worn, stuffed animal, cheeks still streaked with dried tears. Her voice was shaky but firm. "I used to be scared of dogs, but Maverick never made me afraid. He saved me. He's my friend. I want him to come home." The room fell silent. No one dared interrupt, because in that child's voice was a truth no legal form could erase. Then, Jack opened the file. Before city officials, local officers, and a pro bono lawyer brought in by concerned residents, he laid out the irrefutable evidence: Maverick's original K-9 file, training dates, past missions, service photos, and most importantly, a copy of Jack's adoption request, signed, stamped, but marked misplaced. He pointed to the day Maverick was sent to Greg, a date that didn't match any formal K-9 unit decision, without a transfer signature from the command board. Maverick was never lawfully transferred, Jack said, calm but clear. And if we're treating him like property, then this was illegal seizure, followed by abandonment, which is prosecutable under animal protection laws. Murmurs swept through the room. Heads turned. The mayor, who once called Maverick a minor neighborhood issue, bent over the documents. A woman in the back whispered, "He's the one who saved my son during that fire last year. I didn't know it was the same dog." The truth cracked through like water through old stone. Slow at first, but unstoppable. And then, the community stood up. They signed a petition to halt the transfer. A local fund was raised to cover legal costs. A neighborhood reporter began writing the story, headlined, "Who Owns Maverick?" In a show of unity few thought possible from a quiet street, a new story began to be written. This time, grounded in truth. And then, after days of tension that seemed to hold the whole neighborhood in quiet suspense, after long meetings with papers shuffled, witnesses confirmed, and hearts stirred, the local court finally delivered its verdict. Greg Hanley's claim to reclaim Maverick was entirely dismissed. The ruling cited unlawful possession, abandonment in violation of animal protection laws, and, most decisively, undeniable evidence from the K-9 records provided by Jack Monroe, proving Maverick had never been legally transferred out of the police department. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was a rightful recognition of a once-forgotten soul, that he deserved to live like a hero, not be locked away like a discarded object. The day Maverick was released, the sky was a perfect blue, as if the city itself bowed in quiet respect to wordless loyalty. The gate of the holding facility creaked open in the early morning, and the first person Maverick saw wasn't Greg, nor anyone in uniform, but Emily. She stood there with Thomas and Jack, clutching a small watercolor card in both hands. On it was a picture of a big dog and a scribbled message. "Welcome home, Maverick." When Maverick stepped out, he didn't bolt or dash like a dog who'd just been set free. He walked slowly, each step steady, carrying the calm dignity of a soldier returning from war. As he drew near, he lowered his head to let Emily wrap her arms around his neck, then looked up at Thomas. That look, no longer sad but clear and light, seemed to say, "This time, no one's taking me away again." Not long after, a small ceremony was held in the square outside the police station. It wasn't grand, not elaborate, but solemn enough to make the whole neighborhood fall silent. Maverick, wearing a new harness stitched with the words "Retired K-9 Unit," was led onto a wooden platform where the police chief personally stepped forward, bowed his head, and pinned a small silver medal to his chest, engraved with the words, "Honor through Service." And when the chief offered his thanks, not just for the meat shop rescue, but for years of quiet duty, for loyalty that never wavered, the square broke into applause, long and heartfelt. Thomas stood nearby, eyes red but smiling, his hand resting gently on Maverick's back, as if they had both come through a battle without bullets, but not without scars. Emily clung to his sleeve, occasionally glancing at the dog beside her, and smiling with pride. Jack stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the dog he once thought he'd lost. And now, seeing Maverick finally living the life Jack always believed he deserved, he simply nodded, like an old farewell he never quite got to say. And so, in the light of that applause, with sunlight catching the coat once worn and weathered by rain, Maverick held his head high. Not a nameless stray, not forgotten property, but a hero called by name. Honored not for his past achievements, but for the way he lived, quietly, loyally, bravely, and always ready to protect what mattered, even when no one told him he had to. After the day Maverick was set free under a sky full of sunlight and the echo of applause across the small square, with his Honor Through Service medal still swaying gently on the harness around his chest, he returned to Thomas's butcher shop. Not as a stray looking for shelter, but as a son coming home. The old wooden door creaked open, familiar warmth rising from the floorboards, the old towel now replaced by a new rug, carefully chosen by Emily and Grandma Agnes, laid beside the fireplace. And in that moment, as Maverick stepped inside without hesitation, his paws leaving wet prints on the aged floor, Thomas understood. This wasn't just a return. It was a beginning. That same day, at the city office, Thomas filled out the adoption form with a firm hand. The adopter's name read Thomas E. Harrington. In the note section, he wrote, "Reason for adoption, because he chose me first." When the clerk asked if he wanted to change the dog's name for the records, Thomas simply smiled and shook his head. His name is Maverick. It's the name he carried through his life as a soldier. I'm not changing what he spent his whole life defending. The certificate was issued that very day, sealing away all the disputes, misunderstandings, and wrongs Maverick had endured. He was no longer property with a previous owner, nor a retired K-9 in temporary custody. He was now an official member of the Harrington family. From then on, Emily stopped by the shop every day, sometimes to read children's stories next to Maverick, sometimes to wipe his paws before he stepped on the rug, and sometimes just to sit in silence, leaning into his warm body and whispering things no one else could hear. One quiet afternoon, while Thomas was trimming meat and Maverick lay peacefully near the counter, Emily leaned in close and whispered into his ear, her voice soft as the breeze, "You're my quiet warrior." And Maverick, as if he understood, blinked slowly, his tail tapping once against the floor, gentle, without show, just like the name he now fully embodied. People from the neighborhood gradually began seeing the butcher shop as more than a place to buy food. It became a stop to say hi to Maverick. Some left slices of sausage on the counter, others paused after work to stroke his back, and children, once fearful, now eagerly waited their turn to touch the famous police dog. But for Maverick, fame meant little. What mattered was lying in the sunlight that streamed through the window each morning, hearing the rhythm of Thomas's knife against the cutting board like a heartbeat of home, and now and then receiving a small piece of meat placed wordlessly into his paw. A look was all it took to understand. And so, in that small shop in the heart of the city, once just a temporary shelter for an abandoned dog, a real home had taken shape. Not just because there was food, or a place to sleep, or the sound of voices, but because there was love without conditions, a presence that felt like belonging, and a family, not by blood, but by trust. Maverick no longer waited for commands, stood guard against cold and loneliness, and no longer looked around to see who might call his name. Because now, every morning when he opened his eyes, he already knew. He was home. As the first light of day slipped through the butcher shop windows in a waking Brooklyn, warming the cracks in the wooden counter and the fabric of coats hanging behind the door, Maverick had already risen. He lay still for a moment, head resting on his front paws, watching the dew slide down the glass. No sirens, no hurried footsteps, no calls over the radio. Just the familiar sound of a knife slicing steadily behind the counter, the faint scent of fresh meat in the air, and Thomas muttering under his breath as he counted slices like a morning ritual. Thomas looked up from the cutting board and saw him, not with the eyes of an owner looking at a pet, but with the silent understanding of two soldiers who once shared a language beyond words. He set the knife down, wiped his hands with an old cloth, walked over and, like he'd been waiting for this moment, spoke with a warm voice, half joking, half serious. "I could use a sharp pair of eyes. Work with me, soldier?" Maverick didn't bark. He didn't wag wildly or leap forward like most dogs might. He simply stood up, stretched slowly, gave a soft shake that made his silver tag chime gently, and stepped toward Thomas. He stopped beside him. Not out of command, not because of training, not from instinct to obey, but from something deeper, steadier. Choice. He chose to stay. To wake up each day not for patrols, but to see Emily wave from the upstairs window. To lie at the shop entrance, not to secure the premises, but to greet every familiar face that stopped by. To watch the neat arrangement of meat slices, not to detect danger, but to protect the quiet things worth keeping. Jack Monroe, his old friend, trainer, the one who lost him and found him again, still visited every weekend. He'd sit on the wooden bench near the salt barrel and share stories, sometimes about cases, sometimes just the thoughts of a man who once believed the world was too big to ever find the things that mattered most again. Every visit, Jack would reach down, touch Maverick's head, and look at him with an expression more grateful than any words ever spoken. Maverick was no longer a former K9 or a discarded police dog. He was simply Maverick, a name that needed no title, a member of a butcher shop that smelled of smoked meat and morning laughter, a best friend to a little girl who once trembled at the sight of a dog, a calm pair of eyes that always followed Thomas as he cut meat, wiped the counter, or simply sipped coffee in peace. He had become an irreplaceable part of the neighborhood, not as a legend, but as a living, breathing piece of its heart. Maverick's second life didn't begin with a medal or a round of applause. It began with a quiet nod from the man who once opened his arms to him in the rain. And now, in the steady rhythm of a life many would overlook, he had found his true mission: to live fully, to be a friend, and to love without fear. And maybe that's the greatest honor a silent warrior like Maverick could ever receive. So Maverick's journey, the journey of a K9 once abandoned, once broken in body and spirit, didn't end with a gunshot or a command, but with a quiet choice to live in love with a family he chose himself. From a forgotten soldier in a noisy city, he became a quiet symbol of loyalty, of healing, and of starting over, even when life had once been unbearably unfair. If you were the one deciding in that courtroom, what would you have chosen? Paperwork or a beating heart? Share your thoughts in the comments, because maybe your words will be the reason someone finds the courage to do what's right. If you believe every living being deserves a home and a second chance, like this video, share the story and subscribe to the channel to keep following these moving journeys ahead.